If you haven't done so yet, please subscribe to the channel. And if you're enjoying these stories, there's a link below to buy me a cup of coffee. This is the Chassidic Story Project with Barak Hullman, podcasting from Jerusalem, Israel. This podcast is sponsored by listeners just like you. To become a supporter of this podcast, please go to HasidicStory.com. HASIDIC story.com. You'll never know. You'll never know. You'll never know. You'll never know. Shalom Aleichem, my sweetest friends. This week is Gimmel Tamuz, which is the yard site of the Lubavitcher Rebbe of blessed memory. And I can tell you that a large part of this podcast is me having met the Lubavitcher Rebbe when I was 17 years old. It made a huge impact on me. And unfortunately for me, it was the only time that I met the Rebbe. Because even though I was living in New Jersey for many years after that, I could not bring myself to meet the Rebbe a second time. You see, the first time I met the Rebbe, I had no idea who he was. But after I met him, he made such an impression on me that I learned a great deal about him. I became a Baal Tshuva as a result of that meeting. And much of my life really has been on course because of meeting the Rebbe and understanding what a great tsaddik he was. I simply could not bring myself to meet him again. I regret it now, of course, many years later, especially since I have many children that are very devoted Chabad Chassidim. And I wish I had dollars to give to them. But every time that the shaliach at the university that I was at said to me, let's go to the Rebbe for dollars, I would literally jump out of the car. Just the thought of meeting the Rebbe, knowing that he could see from one end of the world to the other, that he could see through my soul. He knew everything I'd done in life and everything I would do in life. That was the feeling that I had in the presence of the Rebbe. I wasn't prepared to meet the Rebbe. I hadn't done the work that I needed to meet the Rebbe. Now that it's 36 years since I've met the Rebbe, I would happily go and meet the Rebbe again if it was possible. But since it's not physically possible to meet the Rebbe, one thing we can do is tell stories about the Rebbe and in a sense reconnect with him in that way. Of course, there are many ways to connect with the Rebbe, through his teachings and through videos online, visiting where he's buried, many ways, and here's one more. But before we begin, as is the custom of this podcast, for the duration of the war, however long it will be, and hopefully it won't be that long, but God only knows what's in store for us over here in Eretz Yisrael. I want to dedicate this podcast episode to the continued success of our soldiers in battle wherever they are. May they wipe out our enemies and keep us safe, and Hashem keep them safe. The returning of all the hostages safe, healthy, whole, and alive. The refuah shlema, the full recovery of everybody who's been injured or is ill. The comforting of those that lost loved ones. And the continued unity of the Jewish people here in the land of Israel and all around the world. The person who told the first story that I have for you didn't mention his name, but he did mention that he wasn't a follower of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and he wasn't a chassid at all. As a matter of fact, he was the head of a kollel, which is where people sit and learn intensively all day. And our storyteller said even though he's not a chassid, he does recognize the greatness of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And this is the story that he told. He was born after World War II and remained an only child because by the time his parents gave birth, they were well into their middle age. And even when he was a young man, he felt that his parents were holding back a secret from him about his birth. And at 24, he became engaged. And a little while before the wedding, his father, who by the time the story was told had passed away, said to his son, "It's time I tell you about the miraculous circumstances surrounding your birth." His parents were some of the lucky Polish Jews because they had escaped to Russia during World War II. Of course, as you know, most of Polish Jewry was murdered by the Nazis in Machshemam, but his parents were able to make it into Russia. And in Russia, they wandered around homeless from place to place until they arrived in the city of Tashkent, which is in the Carpathian Mountains. Now, of course, you know, the Heilige Baal Shem Tov, he was also from the Carpathian Mountains. And so I'm sure it's not by chance that so many Jews ended up in Tashkent. And during the war, Tashkent became a temporary haven for many Jewish refugees, and especially Chabad Chassidim, Lubavitchers. This man's father, when he told his son the story of his birth, He said that his father always spoke highly of the Lubavitchers that he met in Tashkent because he admired the way they were willing to sacrifice themselves. They would go above and beyond in helping their fellow Jews, even beyond their own means. The way they davened with such a deep connection to Kadosh Baruch Hu, to Hashem. But he said the thing that stood out the most for him was how hard they pushed, despite the difficult hardships during those years, how hard they pushed to educate their children and other Jewish children. He said, my father was already 50 years old and his mother 40 years old when the war ended. And because they were Polish citizens and they had a Polish passport, they were able to leave Russia. And not everybody could, by the way. Of course, you know, Reb Mendel Futterfuss, one of the reasons that he ended up in the Gulag in the Soviet prison was because he was trying to get people out of the Soviet Union after World War II with fake Polish passports. But this couple, they had a genuine Polish passport, and they were able to leave Russia. And as they were meeting people from all over Europe who had survived the war, trying to figure out where they would go and establish a new home for themselves, they ended up in Paris. Because it seemed like a good, safe place to start a family after the war. And as we know today, unfortunately, for Jews in Paris, it's not so safe anymore. But back then it was. And when they arrived in Paris, they were very happy to meet many of the people that they had befriended when they were in Tashkent, in Russia. And this man's father was a great Talmid Chacham, was a serious Torah scholar. And so after they arrived in Paris, they were trying to find a shul and a place for his father to learn. And one day after davening, his father meets a Lubavitcher Chassid whose face was beaming. And he says, "Nu, what's going on?" And the Chassid says, "We have a very special guest here in Paris. Rabbi Schneerson, the son-in-law of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, has come to Paris to meet his mother, Rebbetzin Chana Schneerson, who just got out of Russia. There are many stories about the Lubavitcher Rebbe before he became the Rebbe when he was in Paris. And on several occasions, this man's father had the opportunity to meet Rabbi Schneerson in the shul at the Pletzel in Paris, and they would have many conversations. Since his father was a great Talmid Chacham, Torah scholar, the conversations with Rabbi Schneerson were very deep and filled with Torah concepts. And during one of those conversations, Rabbi Schneerson says to his father, "Please tell me about the war." And he tells him how he survived in Russia, and that he and his wife were able to get out with their Polish passports. And when the Rebbe said, "Did you have children? Do you have children?" He said, unfortunately, that they did not yet merit to have children, even though they had been married for over 20 years. And he said, my father could see the compassion in the eyes of Rabbi Schneerson. And Rabbi Schneerson reached out his hand, and took this man's father's hand. And Rabbi Schneerson put both of his hands on his father's hand, and gripped it warmly, like a deep, warm hug. And he said to his father, "May God Almighty enable you to fulfill the mitzvah of V'higadata Levincha next year," which of course is what we say in the Seder, on Seder night, that you will tell it to your children, and they will tell it to their children, and their children. But of course it means specifically that you will tell it to your son. And with that handshake and that blessing, this man was born. He was 2 months old the next year when Pesach approached. And after 2 more years in Paris, his parents decided to move to Israel. And he recalled that every year on the Seder was a very emotional experience for his father. When he got to the part about Avadim Hayinu, we were slaves in Egypt, he would expound upon it patiently with a great deal of love and joy. But the truth is, this man couldn't understand his father's intensity at the Seder until he finally understood how he was born, which was through the blessing of Rabbi Schneerson, who said to him, "May Hashem bless you," who, by the way, didn't bless him directly with a child, which is a lesson in Likutei Moran, the collected teachings of Rabbi Nachman. I've been learning Likutei Moran for many years, and I give a class in Likutei Moran, and there's a Torah in Likutei Moran that says sometimes you can daven for a person directly, and sometimes when the gates of heaven are closed, you have to daven in a roundabout way. And so that's what Rabbi Schneerson did. He said, "May God Almighty enable you to fulfill the mitzvah of V'higadata Levincha, that you should tell the story of the Passover Seder to your son." And of course, in order to do the mitzvah and keep the request of the tsaddik like Rabbi Schneerson, Hashem had to give this man and his wife a child. And that's how he was born. And that's why the Seder nights were so intense in his house. But that's not the end of the story, my sweetest friends. Several years ago, this man's daughter married a yeshiva student from Lakewood, New Jersey. Now, of course, this was in the time that the Lubavitcher Rebbe was still alive, and his daughter was due to give birth around Pesach time, so they decided to plan a family trip to the United States, spend the holiday together, and to wait for the birth of their grandchild. His wife arrived early to help their daughter, and he and his younger children came to New Jersey a week before Pesach. And at that time, he told his son-in-law that he very much wanted to see the Lubavitcher Rebbe and have his younger son receive a blessing from the Rebbe. Now, if you don't know, Lakewood is not exactly a Lubavitcher stronghold. On the contrary, Lakewood, in a sense, are the Misnagdim, the opposers of the Chassidim. So his son-in-law was not very excited to go to the Rebbe, and it was a 2-hour trip to get to 770 in Brooklyn. But this man, who was born by the blessing of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, he was going to meet the Rebbe, and he was going to make sure that his son had a blessing from the Rebbe as well. And when the son-in-law realized that his father-in-law was not going to give up on this, he said, on Sunday morning, the Rebbe hands out dollars, and we can meet him then. And so they arranged a ride to Brooklyn. The son-in-law didn't come, but the father was there with his youngest son. And when they reached 770, they were amazed to see this long, winding line. People waiting to see the Rebbe for hours. They got in line, and they waited their turn. And on the way, the father told his youngest son the miraculous story of his birth. And when his son heard the story, he said, "I was surprised to see that you were so determined to come here. And when I saw how long the line was, and I knew that you don't like to waste time, I wasn't sure what we were doing here. But now that you told me that you were born from a blessing of the Rebbe, of course it makes sense to me." And finally, after hours of slowly moving forward, they reached the point where they could see in the distance the Lubavitcher Rebbe. They could see the holiness and the light emanating from the Rebbe. And he was amazed how alert the Rebbe was, even though he had been standing on his feet for many hours and spoke with thousands of people. Each one he gave a blessing to and handed $1 personally to give to tzedakah. And as the line moved forward, it moved faster than he thought. And this man decided he wasn't going to say anything to the Rebbe. He just wanted to see the Rebbe one time in his life. And finally, they're face to face with the Rebbe. And the Rebbe gives his son first $1. And he says, "Bracha v'atzlacha." And then he asked him in Yiddish, "Are you ready to say the 4 questions?" And this man's son didn't expect the Rebbe to speak to him. And realizing that he wasn't answering the question, the gabbai who was standing there, the attendant, explained the question. And when the son finally understood what was being asked, he said to the Rebbe, "Yes." And then the Rebbe handed him another $1. And he said, "This is for the 4 questions." As the man who was born with the blessing of the Lubavitcher Rebbe approached the Rebbe said, "Bracha v'atzlacha," a blessing and success. And then he handed him another $1, and he said, "This is also for the 4 questions." Then he gave the man a deep, penetrating look. With a big smile, he said, "And also for v'higadeta lavincha," that you should tell it to your son. Meaning that the Rebbe understood that this man, who he'd never met in his life, who was born by the Rebbe's blessing of "may you have a child," that you can say "v'higadeta lavincha" to him. Somehow the Rebbe could see this man's soul and know exactly who he was. And the Rebbe understood that not only had his parents been blessed to have him as their child, so that they could teach the story of the Seder to their son, now he had also been blessed to have his own children that he could tell the story to as well.
Hi, good Shabbos, good Shabbos, good Shabbos. Hallelujah,
I have one more story for you. Also, apparently, names are not mentioned in these stories, but there was a student in yeshiva who was a great genius, a great scholar, full of energy, with incredible memory. But that energy wasn't just for Torah, because even though he could study literally from the morning to night, as soon as he could, he left the yeshiva and went to nightclubs to party away without resting. And because he was literally able to learn all day with such incredible concentration, the teachers in the yeshiva didn't suspect anything. They couldn't imagine how somebody who could learn Talmud and the commentaries with such enthusiasm, like this young man did, could have anything on their mind except for learning Torah. But they were very wrong. Because as soon as the yeshiva day was over, he was at the nightclubs, and let's just say he was doing things that you wouldn't expect from a yeshiva student. And this might have continued forever, who knows, because nobody suspected him of anything. But this young man fell in love with one of the women that he met in the nightclubs. And a short while later, out of great passion, he went to the civil court and married this woman. And she wasn't even Jewish. No, it wasn't a kosher wedding, wasn't a chuppah and kiddushin. Of course, it couldn't be with a non-Jewish woman. But he was legally married. And this young man knew that his parents would never allow him to marry this woman. They were a very traditional family, and they wanted him to marry a Jewish girl, maybe even the daughter of a rabbi. But some non-Jewish woman off the street? Impossible. But rather than tell his parents the truth, he came up with a plan. He would tell his father that he needed to earn money, and he was leaving yeshiva just for a year so he could work. And during that time, he would be married. And over the course of the year, he'd find a way to tell his parents what had happened in a way that hopefully wouldn't hurt them. So he called his father and said he'd been in a car accident. He said, Baruch Hashem, thank God. He wasn't injured, but he destroyed a car that he had borrowed from a friend. And there was no insurance on the car. And he didn't want his friend to suffer the loss, and he wasn't going to take a loan from his parents because he knew they couldn't afford it. So he was going to take a year off of yeshiva and earn money to pay back the debt. But his father said, no way. I will do anything to keep you in yeshiva. You're such a promising student. You're such a great scholar. I want you to live up to your fullest potential. No way you're leaving the yeshiva. So now the yeshiva bachar didn't know what to do. So he came up with a plan. His father was becoming very close to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So he said to himself, the Rebbe was a modern man. He had a degree in engineering. He'd gone to university. And his father respected the Rebbe. So maybe the Rebbe would be the type of person that would agree that the son not be in yeshiva. And if the Rebbe told him to get a job, then his father would have no choice but to accept the Rebbe's decision. And when he said this to his father said, I'm willing to accept whatever the Rebbe says. And just to make sure that his son actually went to the Rebbe, he sent him with his older brother to 770. The two of them imagined that they would be able to arrange a yechidus, a private audience with the Rebbe, but this was impossible. People had been waiting many months to meet the Rebbe, and they weren't going to just meet the Rebbe when they showed up. So he was told to write a letter to the Rebbe, and he wrote down everything he had told his father, the lie about being in a car accident and having to work to make back the money, and he wants to know whether the Rebbe thinks he should remain in yeshiva or go work and make the money. And shortly after giving his letter to one of the Rebbe's secretaries, he returned to see if there was an answer. And as was the Rebbe's custom, he wrote an answer at the bottom of the letter. And the answer surprised this young man. The Rebbe ignored everything that he had said and instead wrote, go home. He didn't say stay in yeshiva, and he didn't say to work. Now this young man had no intention of going home because he wanted to hang out with his new wife and he wanted to live his new life. And going home would not enable that. So he said to himself, nobody has seen the Rebbe's answer. Maybe even the Rebbe's secretary hasn't seen the answer, because it was the practice in 770 not to take the actual note with the Rebbe's handwriting, but to write down the answer on another piece of paper. So this man decided to lie, and he wrote that the Rebbe had told him to go to work and not stay in yeshiva. And his older brother was waiting for him outside of 770. He comes out, and the young bacher, he says, the Rebbe told me to start working and to leave yeshiva. He said, okay, let's go. And suddenly the older brother remembered that he had several friends studying in 770. He said, wait a minute, before we go, I just want to say hi to them. I mean, it wouldn't be right that I was here and I didn't even say hi. And so the older brother went into 770 and he runs into Rabbi Chadakov, who was the Rebbe's personal secretary. And Rabbi Chadakov says to him, the Rebbe sent me to look for you. He wants to see you after the evening prayers. So the older brother, he didn't know what to do, and he waited outside the Rebbe's room that evening. And when the Rebbe came out, he was very direct and straight to the point. He said, take your brother home and don't let him out of your sight. Well, the older brother says, wait a minute, didn't the Rebbe tell my brother to go work and not be in yeshiva? And the Rebbe was very diplomatic about it. He said, whatever was answered before is not important. Right now, take your brother home. So when the older brother told the Rebbe's message to his younger brother, the young man was shaken, because this was the first time that he had to come face to face with reality, and he wasn't enjoying it. He looked at where he had fallen spiritually, and he understood how far he had gone, to make matters worse, according to the law of the land, he was married to a shiksa, to a non-Jewish woman. And now he understood how great the Rebbe was. The Rebbe saw straight through his facade, and he also appreciated that the Rebbe didn't embarrass him. He knew that he needed advice, and so he asked his brother to wait, and he wrote another letter to the Rebbe. This time he told the truth. He told everything to the Rebbe, and he asked the Rebbe what to do. And the Rebbe once again answered him. He says, go home and tell your father the entire story. It's true it will be painful and embarrassing, but the reward that he would receive would outweigh all of the pain and suffering. And then afterwards, his father should contact the Rebbe, and the Rebbe would advise him on where to find a lawyer to annul the marriage. And this young man followed the Rebbe's advice and stayed in touch with the Rebbe for many more years. He was able to marry a Jewish woman, continue learning and growing and becoming a great scholar, and with whoever he could, he would share the story to inspire people to stay on the straight path. Thank you so much for listening, my sweetest friends. Just so you know, there are many, many more stories of the Rebbe on my podcast. If you go to my website, ChassidicStory.com, you click on all episodes on the front page and scroll down to Lubavitcher Rebbe. There are currently 32 stories, some really exceptional stories, enough to keep you entertained for quite a while. I hope you have a beautiful Chodesh Tamuz, even though we have a fast day coming up on the 17th of Tamuz. B'ezrat Hashem, we'll have the revelation of Mashiach Tzidkenu by then. And of course, coming up next week, I have a story that I've been saving for Yud Bet and Yud Gimmel Tamuz, which of course is the festival of liberation for the previous Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, who was also born on the 12th of Tammuz. And in this day, he was freed from imprisonment for being imprisoned by the Soviets for his work in strengthening Torah and the growing of Yiddishkeit in the Soviet Union. So next week I have a story for Yud Bes and Yud Gimmel Tammuz. But until then, my sweetest friends, thank you for listening. And thank you to all the supporters. And thank you to all the contributors. And please keep on sharing. Every week, there are more listeners and more subscribers. And that is thanks to you, my sweetest friends. May you verbring with great joy and take the words of Chassidus and bring them into your hearts and souls and spread the wellsprings of Chassidus outwards until we see the coming of Mashiach Tzidkenu, the cow of Mamish, the coming of the righteous Messiah very soon in our day. Be'ezrat Hashem. Well, if you're still here, my sweetest friends, I have a little bonus story for you. This is one of the older stories on the podcast, but one of my favorites about the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So thanks for sticking around. Here's the bonus story. On a certain religious moshav in Israel, there was a woman who had given birth a couple of times before, and each time she gave birth, she suffered greatly and had many health problems. As her situation worsened, the doctors told her if she ever tried to give birth again, it might be the last time. And now she was pregnant again. She didn't know what to do. She went to all kinds of rabbis and mekubalim, Chassidic rebbes, and anyone she could find for a blessing. She also went to daven by the graves of many tzaddikim buried in the Holy Land. But still she was very worried, and after a doctor examined her and told her that the problems were still there and she was still in danger, she didn't really know what to do. A friend of hers suggested that she contact the Lubavitcher Rebbe in Brooklyn, New York. She thought it was a bit strange, being Israeli. What would the Rebbe know about her in Israel? But she figured she had nothing to lose, and so shortly before she was supposed to give birth, she sent a letter to the Rebbe and quickly received a remarkable response. The Rebbe wrote her back that there's a moshav not far from where she lives, and next to the moshav is a spring. On the other side of the spring was a factory. The workers in the factory leave every afternoon at 4:30. Her husband should walk over there before that hour and stand near the gate, and when the workers come out from finishing their work, he should count them one by one, and when he finds the 10th one, he should follow him. That was the Rebbe's advice. So this couple, they didn't know what to do. First of all, how could the Rebbe ever know these things? And the Rebbe's in New York. What would he know anything about happening in Israel? But the husband said, what do we have to lose? And I want you to be healthy. I'm going to go. So the next day, the husband followed the directions. He found the spring. He found the factory. And he stood outside the gate of the factory and waited, watching his watch until it was 4:30. And just like that at 4:30, the workers began to file out one by one. The husband counted them. 1, 2, 3. When he saw the 10th man, he looked just like an ordinary person. There was nothing special looking about him at all. He seemed hardly distinguishable from any of the other workers before him or after him. The husband shrugged his shoulders and he said to himself, well, the Rebbe told me to follow him, so I'm going to follow him. And the man walked and walked until he finally arrived at a nearby settlement. And then he came to a certain house, walked up the stairs to the house, closed the door behind him, just like anyone else would do after they finished a day of work. The husband stood there, gazing from a distance, not really sure what to do, but realizing that he didn't have any other choice, he walked over and knocked on the door. A woman answered the door and asked how she could help him, and he said he wished to speak with the man who had just entered the house before him, the man who worked at the factory near the spring. The woman simply nodded and told him to wait there, and then she disappeared inside. A few minutes later, she came back with the man that worked in the factory. The man asked the visitor who he was and why he wished to speak with him, and the husband, a little embarrassed, he said, I'm really sorry, I know this sounds strange, and to tell you the truth, I don't know why, but my wife is in a life-threatening situation. And we wrote to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and he said to count the workers and to follow you. And as the husband is talking, the man says, I can't believe it! I can't believe it! And you could see that there was waves of surprise and emotion going over his face. Even here, the holy Rebbe has found me. And then he said to the husband, okay, tell me the whole story about your wife's difficulties giving birth. And so the husband told the story of the wife having difficulty each time she gave birth, and the letter to the Rebbe, and the strange answer. And the husband said, so I went to the factory, and I counted, and you were the 10th man, and I followed you here just like the Rebbe said, but that's all I know. So the factory worker, he just smiled, and he said, wait here for a few moments. Then he went back inside the house, and shortly returned afterwards with a few cubes of sugar in his hand. He said, take these are for your wife. The husband took them, surprised, and then he said, but it's not for this birth. That's because she already gave birth just a few seconds ago. And she and the baby are both healthy, Baruch Hashem. There were no problems at all. The husband was standing there speechless. He didn't know what to say. And then the factory worker continued, these sugar cubes are for future births. If your wife has any problems, give her from these sugar cubes to eat, and everything will be fine right away. The husband couldn't stop thanking the factory worker. Again and again, the two men hugged and then parted ways. And when the husband came back to the moshav, he realized that his wife indeed had given birth with no complications, exactly as the mystery man had said. All of the residents of the moshav were shocked and amazed of the good news of the unexpected smooth birth. And then when they heard the story of this factory worker and the letter from the Rebbe, everyone decided that they had to go and find the hidden tsaddik and get a bracha from him. By the time they got to his house, the house was vacant, and when they went and checked in the factory owner said he had already quit his job and left town. This is a story that was told by a non-Lubavitcher Chassid who was there on the Moshav at the time and heard it firsthand from the couple. Many years later, and this is a story given over by Yerachmiel Tillis, he said they were hosting somebody at a sentence Tzfat, a student from the non-Chassidic Torah of Adas Yeshiva in Brooklyn. And after he heard this story, he said, I have to tell a story about the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And he told the story of his brother-in-law who heard it from his study partner at another non-Chassidic yeshiva. And it turned out to be almost exactly the same story. Difficulty in giving birth, surprise that the holy men had been discovered, and sugar cubes. However, this time it was in a remote location in the northwest coast of the United States. And it entailed getting on a plane and a bus and a taxi to get there. And also in this version, the husband delivered the sugar cubes to his wife just in time for the birth to ease the difficulties. And the husband himself went back to thank the hidden tsaddik. And when he got there, the hidden tsaddik wasn't there anymore. But this time, the husband went to the Rebbe. And he said, Rebbe, here's the story. I found the hidden tsaddik and everything worked out. And the Rebbe just smiled.